The sun, a relentless eye in the vast, indifferent sky, had long since ceased to be a source of warmth for Rob. It was not the physical heat he yearned for, but the warmth that had departed with his beloved Ilara, a void that had swallowed the very light from his world 3 years past, almost to the day. The calendar, marked by the turning of seasons in the unforgiving high desert of the 1880s, offered no solace, only a stark tally of days endured, not lived. Her laughter, once a bright stream flowing through their small, sun-baked homestead, had faded into the echoing silence of the canyons, leaving behind only the grit of dust and the ache of memory. He remembered the precise moment, the way the late autumn wind had whipped through the sparse junipers, carrying with it the first biting chill of a winter that would claim her, a winter that seemed to herald a change, not just in the weather but in the very fabric of existence itself. He had held her hand as the fever stole her breath, the rough calluses of his farmer's palm stark against the delicate coolness of her skin, a memory etched into his soul with the permanence of stone. The small wooden house, once brimming with their quiet routines and shared dreams, became a tomb of loneliness, each creaking floorboard, each dust motile dancing in the shafts of light, a phantom limb of a life that was no more. He watched the nearby town, a cluster of ambition and short-sightedness barely a day's ride away, and saw its inhabitants building higher, wider, always outward, never downward, never inward. Their pride, a brittle thing in the face of nature's ancient power, was palpable, a stark contrast to the humility that Ilara's passing had carved into Rob's very being. The land, stretching for miles in every direction, whispered secrets of survival, of a deep-seated wisdom that transcended the fleeting pursuits of man. He saw the way the ancient formation stood unyielding against the elements, silent sentinels of time, and a nascent, desperate idea, born of grief and a profound understanding of the land's unforgiving truth, began to take root in the desolate chambers of his heart. It was a premonition, a cold dread that clung to him like the scent of wood smoke, a certainty that the world, in its grand, cyclical indifference, was poised for a reckoning that few were prepared to face. He spent his days in quiet toil, his movements precise and deliberate, each task a meditation on the permanence of loss and the fleeting nature of human endeavor, his gaze often drifting towards the towering cliffs that cradled the valley, seeking not escape, but a refuge from a future he felt approaching with the slow, inexorable march of a glacier. He had watched the town grow, its ambitions mirroring its burgeoning population, yet sensed a fundamental disconnect from the earth that sustained them, a hubris that whispered of a coming storm, not of wind or rain, but of something far more profound and chilling. The memory of Ilara's final, fragile breath often visited him in the deep watches of the night, a silent reminder of how quickly life could be extinguished, how utterly vulnerable even the strongest among them truly were, reinforcing the solemn promise he had made to himself. He would never again be caught unprepared, not for himself, and perhaps, not for others, though they knew it not. The whispers began almost immediately, carried on the dry desert winds that scoured the canyons, but Rob remained oblivious, his world now contained within the vast, echoing more of the sandstone cliff, a natural cathedral carved by millennia of water and wind. His decision, born not of madness but of a quiet, desperate logic, was to build his new life within the cave, a monstrous undertaking that consumed every waking hour and every ounce of his grief-hardened strength. He had sold his small homestead, the land where Ilara's memory still lingered like a stubborn mist, for a handful of coins that barely covered the cost of timbers and tools, each transaction a severance from his past, a step further into an unknown future. The cave itself, a sprawling labyrinth of rock and shadow, offered protection from the scorching summer sun and the gnawing winter blizzards, its mouth a gaping invitation to an existence radically different from the flimsy shelters of the valley. He hauled massive logs, each one a testament to his single-minded resolve, across uneven terrain, his shoulders aching, his hands raw and bleeding, the immense labor a brutal balm for his sorrow. He constructed a robust wooden cabin deep within the cavern, its walls stout and true, a sanctuary within a sanctuary, designed to withstand not just the elements, but the very passage of time. The cabin was not a mere dwelling, it was a fortress of self-sufficiency, its interior a marvel of efficient design, far removed from the haphazard sprawl of the town's hastily erected shacks. Outside its wooden confines, within the protective embrace of the cave's colossal overhang, he began to cultivate the earth, bringing in rich topsoil by the bucketful, turning the barren rock floor into fertile ground. He carved out pens for his small herd of cows and goats, their lowing and bleating echoing strangely in the cavern's depths, a living testament to his enduring will. Chickens, too, scratched and clucked, their simple presence a small victory against the looming emptiness. Each nail hammered, each seed planted, each stone placed, was a silent prayer, a desperate act of defiance against the crushing weight of his solitude, against the very idea of helplessness. He envisioned a self-contained world, a bastion against the caprices of a nature he knew could be both bountiful and merciless. The men from the town, venturing out to hunt or trap, would occasionally stumble upon his hidden work, their initial pity slowly curdling into a mixture of bewilderment and scorn. The widower's lost his mind, they'd mutter, their voices carrying easily in the stillness, their words sharp and dismissive. Living like a badger in a hole, Rob heard them, of course, their pronouncements floating into his cave on the same currents of air that brought the scent of sage and distant dust, but he offered no defense, no explanation, for he knew the truth of his purpose was beyond their grasp. He was preparing, not just for himself, but for a world that was stubbornly blind, building a legacy of resilience that would, he knew, be tested in the crucible of a coming despair. His hands, once calloused from tilling open fields, now bore the deeper, more profound marks of stone and timber, scars that spoke of a battle fought not with men, but with the very indifference of the earth itself, a battle he was, against all odds, slowly winning, carving out a habitable world in the heart of solid rock. His preparations continued with an unyielding rhythm, each day a deliberate movement in a grand, unseen design. Rob had transformed a vast section of the cave's floor into an unlikely garden, an emerald ribbon unfurling beneath the colossal stone ceiling, fed by a carefully constructed system of rainwater collection and stored groundwater, a quiet miracle in the arid landscape. Rows of beans, carrots, and hardy greens thrived in the perpetual, cool twilight, their leaves a vibrant splash of life against the muted greys and browns of the rock. He understood the profound wisdom of storing not just food, but the means to produce it, ensuring a continuous bounty. Beyond the garden, near the mouth of the cavern, he had constructed an ingenious, insulated smokehouse, its interior always redolent with the savory scent of cured meats, jerky, bacon, and ham, meticulously preserved against the lean times. Barrels of flour, salt, and dried fruit were stacked high in cool, dry recesses, each one a testament to his foresight, to the hours spent in thoughtful accumulation. His small herd of cows and goats, now accustomed to their subterranean existence, provided fresh milk, cheese, and occasionally, meat, their lowing and bleating a soft, living hum within the cavern's silent grandeur. The chickens, too, laid their eggs with cheerful regularity, their clucking a comforting counterpoint to the distant echoes of falling water. This was not merely survival, it was a thriving ecosystem, meticulously balanced and tirelessly maintained. But the world outside, its hubris swelling with each passing season, saw only the eccentricity, the profound isolation. The town, nestled in the valley, had swelled, its streets now boasting a second saloon and a general store that offered exotic goods from distant cities. Mayor Stone, a man whose prosperity had softened his edges and dulled his perception, often held court at the saloon, his laughter booming, his words dripping with casual contempt. Rob, he would declare, gesturing vaguely towards the cliffs with a half-empty glass, lives like a troglodyte. What good is a man if he shuns progress, shuns his neighbors, shuns the very light of day? Jeremiah, the proprietor of the general store, a man whose ledger dictated his world-view, would nod in agreement, his spectacles glinting in the gaslight. Foolishness, that's what it is. All that effort for what? To hide from a shadow? A waste of good timber. Even Agnes, the town's most prolific gossiper, whose tongue was sharper than any knife, would add her venomous observations. His poor wife, Ilara, bless her soul. If she could see him now, she'd surely weep. A man consumed by grief, building a tomb for himself. Their words, like tiny stones, were hurled at the distant, silent figure in the cliffs, each one designed to diminish, to dismiss, to reinforce their own sense of superior practicality. They could not conceive of a man who would prepare for a danger they refused to acknowledge, their minds too steeped in the comforting rhythm of predictable seasons, too confident in their own ability to tame the wild. Rob, however, carried their mockery not as a burden, but as a confirmation of his path. He knew the difference between enduring wisdom and fleeting comfort, between true security and the illusion of it. His resolve only deepened, fueled by the conviction that the time for reckoning, for a brutal clarity, was drawing ever closer. He often found himself pausing in his work, listening to the almost imperceptible shifts in the earth, the subtle changes in the air that spoke of something deeper than mere weather, a primal sense that the world was holding its breath, poised for a transformation that would shake the very foundations of their complacent certainty. He was ready for it, and his careful, solitary existence was the undeniable proof. The mockery, once a low hum of derision, had crescendoed into a chorus of open contempt, a relentless drumbeat against the perceived folly of Rob's subterranean world. The town, bloated with its newfound prosperity and its unwavering belief in human dominance over nature, saw his cave dwelling not as a testament to resilience, but as an affront to their collective understanding of what constituted a proper life. Mayorstone, emboldened by the continued mildness of the autumn, had even taken to using Rob as a public example of misguided eccentricity during his weekly pronouncements from the porch of the general store. "Look at Rob," he would bellow, his voice carrying down the dusty main street, "hold up like a badger against a winter that will be no harsher than the last. He wastes his days in the dark, while we build a future in the light. What does he fear? A ghost? A shadow?" The townsfolk, gathered to listen, would laugh, their amusement a thick, palpable thing that reinforced their own sense of security. Jeremiah, ever the pragmatist of the market, would add, "He buys nothing from my store. A self-sufficient man, he calls himself." I call him bad for business. This sentiment resonated deeply with many, for Rob's independence was, in its own way, a silent criticism of their consumerist tendencies. Agnes, never one to be outdone, spun tales of Rob conversing with the goats, of him drawing strange symbols on the cave walls, exaggerations that cemented his image as a man unhinged by grief and solitude. Yet, amidst the cacophony of dismissal, there were subtle cues, almost imperceptible to the complacent, that the natural world itself was beginning to shift. The autumn, usually crisp and vibrant, had lingered with an unsettling warmth, its days stretching long and golden, its nights lacking the usual bite. The migratory birds, typically a noisy procession through the valley skies, were sparse, their calls unusually muted, a strange silence descending upon the familiar routes of their passage. The old men, the few who still remembered the tales of the great freezer generations ago, would exchange worried glances, their words hushed, their warnings dismissed as the rambling of senility. "There's a quiet in the air," Old Man Hemlock, his eyes clouded with age and wisdom, mumbled one afternoon, "a stillness that ain't natural. The sky's too bright, the ground too dry." This ain't right. His words were met with a dismissive wave from a young rancher, confident in the strength of his new brick homestead. "Just the usual talk, Hemlock. Another mild winter." You'll see, the collective hubris of the town was a thick, insulating blanket, shielding them from the subtle harbingers of change. They saw the warm days as a blessing, a continuation of their easy prosperity, rather than an ominous deviation. They were too busy constructing new homes, expanding their fields, and planning for the spring fair to notice the unusual clarity of the distant peaks, the peculiar way the light seemed to flatten and fade just before dusk, a subtle alteration in the visual texture of their world. Rob, deep within his rock sanctuary, felt these changes, not just as observations, but as visceral warnings. He noted the prolonged absence of the migrating elk, the almost unnerving silence of the winter sparrows. He checked his stores, reinforced his cabin's insulation, and ensured his livestock were well-fed and protected, his meticulous attention to detail a stark contrast to the town's blithe disregard. He was preparing for a winter not of typical severity, but of an ancient, forgotten wrath, a cold that would strip away the veneer of civilization and expose the raw, vulnerable core of existence, a reckoning he knew was now mere days, perhaps even hours, from descending upon their unsuspecting world. He knew the cost of their ignorance, and the slow-burn dread within him was not for himself, but for the collective blindness that had settled like a shroud over the valley, a blindness that would soon be shattered by an unimaginable chill. The morning of December 14, 1888, dawned not with the customary pink and gold blush of a high desert sunrise, but with a profound, leaden grey that pressed down upon the land, silent and suffocating. A strange, unnatural stillness had fallen over the valley, a terrifying absence of even the faintest breeze, as if the very air itself had frozen in anticipation. The temperature, which had hovered stubbornly in the unseasonably warm 30s Fahrenheit just hours before, began its precipitous descent, not with the gentle slope of a typical cold front, but with the brutal, sickening drop of a stone plunging into a deep well. By mid-morning, The mercury in the town's only outdoor thermometer, mounted proudly outside Jeremiah's general store, had plummeted to a shocking 5 degrees Fahrenheit, a chilling testament to the swiftness of the change. This was not merely cold, this was a visceral, penetrating cold that defied all memory and expectation, a predatory chill that seeped into bone and marrow, silencing the usual sounds of the bustling town. The normal clatter of hooves on packed earth, the distant ring of a blacksmith's hammer, the cheerful cries of children, though Rob had no children of his own, he could recall the distant sound of others from the valley, all had ceased, replaced by a profound, eerie quiet. Mayor Stone, emerging from his well-heated home, pulled his heavy woolen coat tighter around him, his breath fogging in thick plumes. He cursed under his breath, dismissing the sudden drop as an anomaly, an unusually fierce snap that would surely pass by noon. Just a cold spell, he grumbled to a shivering Jeremiah, who was struggling to unlock his store's frozen door. Nothing that a good fire and a hot toddy won't fix. But even as he spoke, a new, more menacing wave of cold descended, stripping the air of any residual warmth, transforming the very light into something brittle and sharp. The temperature continued its relentless fall, a descent that defied belief, dipping below 0 Fahrenheit by early afternoon. Panic, a cold dread far more insidious than the physical chill, began to creep through the town, replacing the earlier dismissal. Windows, hastily shut against the biting air, began to frost over from the inside, obscuring the view of a world rapidly transforming into a tableau of stark, unforgiving white. The few remaining animals outside, dogs and stray cats, huddled miserably, their fur stiffening with frost, their whimpers swallowed by the vast, oppressive silence. Rob, deep within the protective embrace of his cave, felt the shift acutely, not from a thermometer, but from the subtle changes in the very air that permeated his rock sanctuary. The air entering his ventilation system, usually a gentle flow, now carried a distinct, cutting edge, a premonition of the unprecedented chill that gripped the outside world. He walked through his subterranean farm, checking on his livestock, observing their placid movements, their warm breath visible in the cooler cave air. The wooden walls of his cabin, thick and insulated, held the generated warmth of his small stove, a stark contrast to the rapidly freezing world above. His vegetables continued to grow, their green leaves unbothered by the unfolding crisis, a silent testament to the wisdom of his preparations. He heard no cries, no distant shouts, only the lowing of his cattle and the soft scuffle of his goats, sounds of life sustained, protected. The silence from the valley, however, spoke volumes, a profound and terrifying quiet that confirmed his deepest fears, and cemented the agonizing truth of his solitary foresight. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than any cold, that the true test had begun, not just for him, but for the entire valley, for a collective reckoning that would separate the resilient from the unprepared, the wise from the foolish, in the most brutal and unforgiving manner imaginable. The world outside Rob's cave transformed into a tableau of unimaginable horror as the great cold deepened its grip. What began as an alarming plummet in temperature swiftly became a catastrophic free fall, defying every known meteorological record and every cautionary tale passed down through generations. By late afternoon on that grim December 14th, the very air seemed to crackle with an unseen menace, the moisture in it freezing instantly into a fine, sharp powder that stung the skin and clawed at the lungs. The thermometer outside Jeremiah's store, now a mere ornament of a forgotten, warmer time, registered an unthinkable 25 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, a number that brought a visceral terror to even the most hardened men of the valley. This was not a winter storm, this was an extinction event unfolding in slow motion, a siege laid by nature's most primal, unforgiving force. The town, once so vibrant and self-assured, now huddled in a desperate, shivering silence, broken only by the mournful, guttural cries of those succumbing to the cold's relentless embrace. Firewood, gathered carelessly during the mild autumn, dwindled with terrifying speed, each precious log thrown onto dwindling embers a desperate prayer for survival. Homes, built with only a passing thought to extreme cold, offered little protection, their thin walls and ill-fitting windows mere sieves against the invading chill. Water pipes froze solid and burst, silencing the gurgle of life-giving water, while stored food began to harden and crack in unheated pantries, becoming useless husks of sustenance. Mayor Stone, his ruddy face now a mask of ashen terror, stumbled through the deepening twilight, knocking frantically on doors, his booming voice reduced to a hoarse whisper. "We need more wood. Anyone, any spare logs? Our families are freezing," he cried, the desperate plea ripping through the icy air. But no one answered. Each family was an island of fear, their own supplies perilously low, their own loved ones huddled miserably, their tiny bodies shivering uncontrollably. Jeremiah, his spectacles fogged with his own labored breath, could only stare blankly at his empty shelves, the bounty of summer now a cruel, mocking memory. His own family, sheltered in the back of his drafty store, huddled under every blanket they possessed, their teeth chattering a frantic rhythm against the rising tide of despair. The mocking laughter that had once echoed through the valley, aimed at Rob's solitary preparations, had long since died, replaced by the low keening of the wind and the more terrible sound of human suffering. The air itself grew heavier, denser, as if the very breath of the world was being stolen away. Even the seasoned trappers and hunters, men who prided themselves on their resilience against the elements, found themselves utterly unprepared for this scale of environmental hostility. Their furs offered scant comfort, their knowledge of the wild suddenly rendered obsolete by a cold that transcended all experience. A profound sense of inevitability settled over the town, a chilling realization that their comfortable lives, their proud structures, their very existence, were utterly fragile against the immense, indifferent power of the earth. The light that remained was a harsh, unforgiving glare, reflecting off the deepening layer of frost that coated every surface, transforming the familiar into something alien and terrifying. They looked towards the cliffs, towards the dark maw of the cave that housed Rob, no longer with scorn, but with a dawning, terrible understanding, a desperate, unspoken question forming on their frozen lips. Had he, in his solitary wisdom, seen this coming, this absolute and unforgiving erasure of their world? The quiet allies, those few who had always held a grudging respect for Rob's methodical nature, now felt a cold knot of dread tighten in their stomachs, not just for themselves, but for the collective blindness that had led them to this precipice. As the first full night of the unprecedented freeze descended, a true and horrifying darkness fell upon the valley, not merely the absence of light, but the crushing weight of isolation and despair. The temperature continued its malevolent descent, settling at an ungodly 35 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, a number whispered with disbelief and dread among the few still capable of coherent thought. Homes that had been merely cold hours earlier now became tombs of ice, their inhabitants huddling together, praying for a dawn that seemed increasingly unlikely. The fires, once roaring with arrogant confidence, had dwindled to flickering embers, their heat insufficient to combat the pervasive, penetrating cold that seeped through every crack and crevice. The silence, once merely unnerving, became an active presence, a monstrous entity that swallowed cries for help, muffled the desperate coughs of the ailing, and absorbed the quiet sobs of the vulnerable. The town's collective pride, once a towering edifice, crumbled into dust under the relentless assault of the elements, replaced by a raw, primal fear. It was then, in the deepest hour of that terrible night, that the first hesitant steps were taken towards the cliffs, towards the very refuge they had so vehemently mocked. A few of the younger men, fueled by the desperate cries of their families and the terrifying realization of their own imminent demise, stumbled out into the frigid night, their faces raw and frostbitten, their movements clumsy with cold. They were not seeking rescue, not yet, they were seeking warmth, a flicker of hope, a desperate chance at survival. Mayor Stone, his dignity long abandoned, his face etched with unspeakable grief, followed close behind, driven by a horrifying vision of his town dying around him, a consequence of his own complacent leadership. Jeremiah, his face ghostly pale, clutching a small, whimpering loved one wrapped in tattered blankets, joined the growing procession, each step a testament to a desperate, newly awakened understanding. The journey to the cliffs, usually a pleasant hour's ride, became an arduous, agonizing trek through a landscape transformed into a frozen hell. The ground was treacherous, slick with hoarfrost, and the air, so dense with cold, made every breath a burning agony. They moved as ghosts in a world of ice, their figures hunched against the invisible blades of the wind, their eyes fixed on the distant, dark maw of the cave, now appearing not as a symbol of eccentricity, but as a beacon of impossible salvation. They remembered Rob's words, or rather, his silence, his tireless work, his unwavering conviction, and the crushing weight of their own dismissive mockery pressed down upon them, a moral burden far heavier than the biting cold. He saw this, whispered a young woman, her voice hoarse with cold and shame, to her companion. He knew her companion, a rancher who had openly scoffed at Rob's badger hole, could only nod, his eyes wide with a dawning horror and regret. The very air around them seemed to thicken with unspoken apologies, with the bitter taste of missed opportunities and ignored warnings. Each faltering step brought them closer to the tangible evidence of their collective folly, to the man they had scorned, now their only hope. The distance between the town and the cave, once measured in miles, now felt like an unbridgeable chasm, a vast expanse of frozen regret, but they pressed on, propelled by the primal instinct for life, by the desperate need to believe that one man's unwavering foresight might yet redeem their collective blindness. The image of Rob, solitary and resolute, toiling in the mouth of his cavern, flashed through their minds, no longer a figure of ridicule, but an almost mythical sentinel against a world gone mad, a living testament to the profound wisdom of listening to the quiet whispers of the earth rather than the loud pronouncements of human pride. The first group of frozen, desperate souls finally reached the cavern's mouth in the deep hours before dawn, their bodies numb with cold, their minds dulled by the ceaseless battle against the encroaching death. Their cries, feeble and choked by the ice that coated their throats, were little more than ragged whispers carried on the deadly current of the air. Yet, even these faint sounds were enough to stir Rob from his deep, watchful sleep. He had expected them, in the grim, prophetic chambers of his heart, had known this moment was an inevitability, not a surprise. He moved with a practiced, somber efficiency, lighting additional lamps, stoking the roaring fire in the massive stone hearth he had painstakingly built, its warmth radiating outwards, a palpable promise against the crushing cold outside. As he approached the cave's entrance, the sight that met him was one of utter desolation. Figures, huddled and frozen, stumbled through the last few yards, their faces etched with suffering and a dawning, terrible realization of their predicament. Mayor Stone, his once imposing frame now slumped and defeated, was among the first, his eyes, hollowed by fear and grief, meeting Rob's. There was no anger, no accusation, only a profound, silent plea that spoke volumes of shattered pride and desperate need. Rob did not speak, his own face a mask of quiet resolve, reflecting the gravity of the moment, the immense sorrow for what they had endured. He simply opened the heavy, insulated wooden door he had crafted, the portal to his sanctuary, and stepped aside, allowing the first few, weakest souls to stumble inside. The warmth that enveloped them was immediate, a sudden, shocking embrace after hours of relentless cold, bringing with it a wave of profound, tearful relief. Jeremiah, his small loved one clutched protectively to his chest, was among the next, his voice, when he finally found it, a broken, trembling thing. "Rob," he rasped, his eyes welling with tears, we were wrong." "So terribly wrong," Rob merely nodded, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the arriving townspeople, a sea of frostbitten skin, blue lips, and eyes wide with a mixture of terror and dawning hope. He gestured towards the open space within the cave, beyond the warmth of his cabin, where he had prepared an area with layers of straw and blankets, a makeshift refuge for the inevitable. "Come in," he said, his voice low and steady, lacking any trace of triumph or recrimination. "There is room. There is warmth." The sheer scale of the crisis became apparent as more and more people arrived, their numbers growing from a trickle to a steady, desperate stream. They brought with them the chilling tales of those who had perished, those who could not make the journey, those whose fires had died and whose hope had faded in the relentless grip of the cold. The air inside the cave, once filled only with the lowing of animals and the quiet sounds of Rob's work, now echoed with the shivering gasps of the afflicted, the low murmurs of shock, and the soft cries of those being tended to. It was a scene of stark contrasts, the vibrant, living sanctuary Rob had built against the dying world outside. There was no room for "I told you so's," no space for anger, only the immediate, desperate need to survive, to protect, to offer succor. Rob moved among them, a silent sentinel of mercy, distributing warm blankets, offering sips of hot broth, his actions speaking louder than any words, a testament to a compassion that transcended the pain of past ridicule. He understood that this was not a moment for judgment, but for unity, for the shared struggle against a common, relentless enemy. The profound stillness of the night outside, broken only by the mournful groaning of the freezing earth, was a constant, stark reminder of the fragile line between life and oblivion, a line that Rob, in his quiet, resolute way, had meticulously woven for himself and now, for them, by the sheer force of his enduring, often misunderstood, foresight. The crisis within the cave, though harrowing, began to forge a new kind of unity, a bond born of shared suffering and a desperate reliance on one man's unwavering foresight. The days that followed blurred into a continuous struggle against the insidious remnants of the cold that clung to their bodies and the creeping despair that threatened to overwhelm their spirits. Rob, once the solitary figure of ridicule, now moved among them with a quiet authority, his movements precise, his decisions unhesitating. He did not issue commands, but offered guidance, his actions a silent invitation to collaborate, to contribute to the collective survival. There was an unspoken understanding that permeated the cavern. They were all in this together, and Rob's unwavering compassion had granted them this fragile second chance. The initial shock gave way to a dawning, collective shame, a deep regret for the years of scorn and dismissal they had heaped upon him. Mayor Stone, humbled beyond recognition, approached Rob one somber morning, his eyes downcast, his voice barely a whisper. "Rob," he began, his voice thick with emotion, I have done you a great wrong. We all have. Forgive us our blindness." Rob looked at the mayor, not with condemnation, but with a profound, sorrowful understanding. "There is no time for blame, Mayor," he replied, his voice gentle but firm. "Only for living. Only for working." And so, a quiet transformation began. The proud townsfolk, stripped of their societal pretensions by the brutal hand of nature, shed their former roles and embraced the raw necessities of survival. Men who had once boasted of their wealth now diligently chopped firewood from Rob's meticulously stacked reserves, their hands, once soft, now roughened by the unaccustomed labor. Women who had disdained manual tasks now helped prepare meals from Rob's preserved stores, carefully rationing each portion, their laughter, once frivolous, now a soft, weary comfort. Jeremiah, the general store owner, with his eye for organization, helped Rob manage the distribution of supplies, ensuring fairness and preventing panic. Agnes, the erstwhile gossiper, now moved silently among the sick and the weakest, offering what comfort she could, her sharp tongue replaced by a gentle, compassionate touch. The vulnerable, those who had survived the initial onslaught, huddled together, their eyes wide with a newfound solemnity, their play subdued, reflecting the grave atmosphere that now pervaded their world. They learned, quickly and instinctively, that survival demanded cooperation, that the true measure of a man was not his wealth or his position, but his willingness to lend a hand, to share the burden. Rob's animals, once a source of amusement, now became a vital part of their existence, providing milk and the promise of future sustenance. The cave, once perceived as a dark, isolated dwelling, slowly began to morph into a communal sanctuary, a testament to human resilience and the profound capacity for change when confronted with existential threat. The air, though still carrying the chill of the outside world, was warmed by the collective breath of shared endeavor, by the flickering hope that began to rekindle in their eyes. The memory of the outside world, a landscape of frozen death, lingered like a terrifying ghost, but within the cave, life, against all odds, continued its fragile, persistent beat. Rob, observing their quiet industry, their genuine efforts, felt a profound shift within his own grief-hardened heart. The bitterness of years of isolation began to recede, replaced by a nascent, fragile sense of belonging, a quiet satisfaction that his solitary efforts had not been in vain, that his foresight, however mocked, had ultimately served a higher purpose, the preservation of life itself. The silence between them was no longer one of scorn or misunderstanding, but of shared purpose, a reverent acknowledgement of the profound truth that had been revealed by the unforgiving hand of winter. When the great cold finally receded, weeks later, leaving behind a landscape irrevocably scarred but slowly awakening, the world that emerged was vastly different from the one that had been swallowed by ice. The sun, a welcome, gentle caress after its long, terrifying absence, cast new light on a transformed valley. The town, or what remained of it, was a desolate tableau of shattered structures and frozen memories, a stark monument to human hubris. Yet, from the depths of Rob's cave, a new community emerged, chastened but unbroken, a living testament to resilience and the profound power of communal reckoning. The men and women who stepped back into the sunlight were changed forever, their faces etched with the lines of endurance, their eyes holding a depth of understanding they had never possessed before. The mockery and dismissal that had once defined their relationship with Rob had transmuted into a profound reverence, a deep and abiding respect for the man who had seen what they could not, and who, despite their scorn, had offered them refuge. Mayor Stone, no longer a figure of pomp and self-importance, but a man stripped bare by grief and humility, gathered the survivors. "We owe Rob everything," he declared, his voice firm despite its tremor, not just our lives, but the very lesson of our lives. We built with pride, and he built with foresight. Our arrogance nearly cost us everything. He then turned to Rob, his gaze unwavering. Rob, this valley, what remains of it, needs your wisdom. Your way. We ask you to lead us, to teach us how to build a new, not just homes, but a community that remembers the lessons of this winter. Rob, ever the man of few words, looked out at the broken landscape, then at the faces of the survivors, their eyes earnest, their hearts open. He saw not the people who had mocked him, but the people who had learned, who had transformed through crisis. He saw the potential for a new beginning, a legacy born not of material wealth, but of enduring wisdom and shared humanity. He agreed, not with a flourish, but with a quiet, resolute nod, recognizing the profound responsibility that now lay upon his shoulders. The cave, once his solitary refuge from grief, became a symbol of collective rebirth, its internal garden a blueprint for a renewed understanding of sustainability. The techniques he had employed, the rainwater harvesting, the carefully managed livestock, the deep storage, became the cornerstones of the new valley. They rebuilt, not outwards and upwards, but with a conscious humility, integrating the lessons of the rock, designing structures that honored the land's power rather than defying it. The memory of Ilara, which had once driven Rob into isolation, now became a quiet, guiding light, a poignant reminder of the preciousness of life and the importance of preparedness. He had built his sanctuary not just for himself, but, unknowingly, for the future of his community, a future that Ilara, in her quiet grace, would have surely championed. Years passed. The valley, slowly but surely, bloomed anew, not with the reckless abandon of its former self, but with a conscious, measured growth. Generations grew up hearing the story of the great freeze, of the widower who lived in the cave, and of the profound wisdom he held. The cave itself became a pilgrimage site, a place of quiet reflection, a living museum of resilience. Rob, though he remained a man of quiet demeanor, was revered as the valley's patriarch, his life a living testament to the enduring truth that true strength lies not in defiance, but in understanding, not in pride, but in humility, and that sometimes, the greatest wisdom is found in the stillness of solitude, listening to the ancient whispers of the earth. His legacy was not carved in stone, but woven into the very fabric of their renewed existence, a continuous, living lesson passed down through generations, ensuring that the unbearable cost of ignorance would never again be paid. The vast, indifferent sky, which had once presided over unimaginable tragedy, now bore witness to a profound and lasting redemption, a testament to the enduring power of foresight, compassion, and the quiet, unwavering spirit of a single, resolute man.